Hi, my name is Martin Purnell, and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation and not necessarily change your mind prior to listening. Our email address, should you want to contact us, is ogc@accessradio.biz, and biz is spelt B-I-Z. That's ogc@accessradio.biz. So, who's today's guest? Well, he's not only a director of a professional English League football club, but also co-founder and group corporate director of Succession Wealth. This business company is entrusted with over £10 billion of money from over 19,000 clients. No wonder they have a staff of over 600 people. He is a reviewer for the UK government's Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And yet our guest still has time to make sure his Christian values and ethos are key to his personal and business life. Our guest dedicates time as well into mentoring and supporting young people so that they can achieve their full life potential. So, how does he maintain his strong Christian beliefs in a business that is all about financial growth? What were the pros and cons when being in this occupation? What was it like meeting the rich and famous when living in Monte Carlo? And will Exeter City ever make it to the Premier League? Gives me great pleasure to welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, Paul Morrish. Paul, thank you for joining us today. Might be a silly question because I might have given the answer already. Where are we speaking to you from today, please, good sir?
Okay, good. Nice to be part of your podcast, Martin. Thanks for inviting me. I'm in Exeter, born and bred in Exeter, disappeared from my huge chunks of my career, came back via university in Bradford and a spell as a student in Nice, and as you said, working in Monte Carlo when I joined Barclays, and moved back to Exeter via Warwick in 2005. So been here ever since.
Well, unfortunately, my French isn't as good as yours, so we'll do it in English if that's okay, good sir.
Pas de problème.
Pas de problème, merci. Question 1. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask him questions, who would it be, Paul?
It would be Bono of U2.
Hey.
There are lots of reasons for that. One is I do love getting somewhere first. I saw U2 the day their War album came out. It was in the days when the chart show was on a Tuesday, and U2 were performing, supported by The Alarm, another great band I love, of Wales. My wife's Welsh, so she'll love that bit. Yeah, U2 were performing in the Great Hall at Exeter University, so I trundled up there, dragged along for what I think was my first ever gig. Watched Bono scaling the speakers and what have you, and hung on to it because it maybe sounds probably slightly more street cred than I don't know much about music. So I used to talk about I first saw U2, and then I've seen it. We've watched them loads since, but one of the interesting things for me with Bono is he always puts his heart on his sleeve around anything he is passionate about and doesn't really care who he speaks to about it, whether it's American presidents or, well, actually any world leader, I suppose, when you look at it, down to what the world would consider to be the lowest of the low. And there's an integrity there, but also if you cut him open, you'd get the same whether you were blue-blooded, red-blooded or very little-blooded around what he's about. And I think he's also honest about the fact that God's at the root of who he is and faith is, but that doesn't make it all straightforward and easy and bland for him. And, the honesty of saying, there are times when it's easy, times when it's tough, times when I have questions, times when I'm on mountaintops, etc., etc. I always find very refreshing. And to be able to then turn that into something which he puts inside his opportunities, the gifts he's got as a musician, but also the places and people he encounters, I find hugely inspirational.
Well, that's a great answer. You'll be pleased to know that you're not the first person to choose Bono.
Oh, right, okay.
I have to take you back to Exeter for your gig, your first ever gig. I saw U2 as well on the water at the Bristol Colston Hall, as it used to be known. Well, we used to call it Colston Hall, but we didn't have The Alarm, a support band. We had an Australian band, I think, the Blue Cats or something.
Okay.
So I missed out on that one because I love The Alarm as well. Had the privilege of seeing Mike Peters do his first ever solo gig at Bath Moles after leaving the band The Alarm, but I never saw The Alarm. So, wow. Very good answer. Yes.
Perfect.
Have you ever met Bono by any chance?
No, not at all. Not at all. I met Mike Peters a few times.
Yeah.
He's often in Exeter. In fact, he was in Exeter last autumn before he got ill again.
Yes.
Went over and had the obligatory photo, and we do the same with a guy called Martin Joseph, actually, you've probably heard of as well.
Yes.
So love him. And watching people, again, in the case of Mike Peters, the same, isn't it? His life's not easy, far from easy with his illnesses, but still he tries to be who he is.
Yes.
And the heart on the sleeve in the music is the heart on the sleeve as the person as well. So I love it. I think it's great to be real.
Yes, it is. I had the privilege of interviewing Mike Peters a couple of times, went on to really, really, as you say, Lovely bloke, genuinely
Yeah,
nice bloke.
yeah.
So if anyone knows how I can get hold of Martin Peters.
Yeah, I don't think you'll get hold of him at the moment.
No, he's slightly detained, isn't he, unfortunately?
Yeah.
If anyone knows how I can get hold of Mike Peters, please let me know. That'd be great. Question 2. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable, please, sir?
I'm going to steal 2 answers out of this, if I may, but the first one's quick.
Please.
My favourite character is Onesimus. It's just because Onesimus did the right thing quietly in the background, and Paul refers to him only once, I think. I just love the fact that he was important in ministry to someone where he was quite comfortable being who he was, doing what he was doing. There's a lovely reference to him in the New Testament in one of Paul's letters. So that's my character. The parable, actually, I find relatively easy because I think it's the parables that generally have inspired me all the way through my life. One is Parable of the Lost Son, and that's particularly, I think, because, and I'll refer to this a bit later in our conversation, I'm sure, I use a phrase to describe myself where I say, I need to put my hand in the fire to realise that fire burns you, and then I don't do it again. The problem is I do find lots of fires. The parable of the lost son, I think, is a great way of reminding us all, but me particularly, that you're never really lost and there's always a way back. And the opportunity to then reflect on the stuff that you learned by making mistakes is a powerful thing, as long as you're prepared to be humble enough and put it to use. It's led to a lot of my beliefs around mentoring. I mentor a lot of people. It's an honour and a privilege, to be honest. I'm paid to do it. There's a great Chinese proverb about mentoring that connects me back to the prodigal son, which is, mentoring is all about giving back to someone on your way back down the road that which you learned on the way up the road that they are travelling. And I think that sense in which someone's walking up a road you've already walked, they may not go the same path and the same directions and bump into the same things, but you have stuff as you come back you should be looking to pass on to them so they maybe don't bump into the bad stuff themselves. And that's been a big part of me learning humility. I'm not very humble, I should be much more. And also that God turns the bad stuff into good, and a lot of that good comes when you give it away. But fundamentally, probably linked a bit to that same principle, my most powerful, inspirational, fundamental parable for me is the parable of the talents, because it starts from the place that we all have gifts, every single one of us, and we all have potential. And the question of how we align the gifts and the potential is hugely, hugely important to use. Probably one of my favourites, certainly, verses in the Bible from Luke 12, to whom much is given, much is expected. But we've all got much relative to others. The question of unlocking potential in people, as God's gifts and God's creation is probably the most powerful motivator in my life. Whether that's about what I've sought to do myself, not always brilliantly, but also particularly what I try to encourage others to see, regardless of whether they are in a lowly or in a fantastic situation. They've got stuff that's locked up in potential that God gave them to go and plant and grow if it's done for the right reason, in the right ways, in the right places.
Fantastic 2 answers. And when you mentioned about the Chinese proverb about walking up the road and down again, and you also mentioned about the fire, you want to make sure that you learn from what you've done, but it doesn't mean in the case of the fire, you actually have to go and stick your head in the fire as well.
It does tie back to Onesimus, you see, because what Paul says about Onesimus is, formerly you were useless, but now you are useful to me. And it ties both those themes together very well for me, acknowledging that no one is actually useless, but we all have a use and a purpose. It gives reason for living to anyone, and so it should do.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Oh, this podcast is going to be something else. I can just feel it in me bones, as they might say. Question 3. This could be very interesting then. I look forward to this answer. If you were Prime Minister, Paul, for the day and could change any law or impose a new law, what would it be?
I think it ties to the theme of my last answer, although I didn't do that consciously, actually. Every employer would have to employ at least one person who lives on the margins of society as a means of giving them worth. Every employer, I don't care whether it's a corner shop owner or Tesco's. And also that every landlord who had over a certain number of rooms in their property they were renting out has to provide a given percentage of those rooms for someone who's homeless. So sitting in exactly the same space, if you've got something, whether it's a business, whether it's a property that you're seeking to make commercial gain from, you pass that gain back by way of obligation imposed by the Prime Minister for the day.
Good luck with that. Do you think you get it through?
I'd love to.
Yeah.
You walk up any high street, don't you, and you see the reasons why. I do think there's an awful lot locked up in that question, and the answer, I suppose, too, around definitions as well. I got taught, advised, schooled, call it what you will, early in my own seeking to be a part of just joining in with the lives of those who don't have much, who we would label as homeless, by actually seeing and hearing them referred to as those who live on the margins of society. Because that takes many forms. Many people who are homeless actually don't want to live with a roof over their head, and that's their choice. They've still got stuff that which we should be giving to them to live by way of opportunity. And similarly, those who are on the margins of society for reasons of exclusion or caused by things that they've chosen to do deserve to find their way back in and to find worth associated with who they are as a human being. And they're both linked to the same point, but also linked to the reason I gave the answer.
I don't want to make this a football-themed podcast at all, but the name Lou Macari comes to mind because he's got a thing about the homeless, and he was able to take over in Stoke-on-Trent warehouse because he realised that homeless people, even though they genuinely wanted to make a go of their lives, often couldn't because they didn't have a bank account. And I don't know if you know this story. He took over a warehouse and worked alongside Stoke-on-Trent Council and was able to put into them the glam pods, i.e. little wooden sheds really. Mm. But each shed was given over to somebody who was homeless. And because they had a number on it, that meant they had their own private address within the warehouse. So then they were able to go and get a bank account.
Oh, brilliant.
Well done, Lou. What a fantastic thing you did there.
Yeah.
And as you say, there's so many empty places throughout the land, it wouldn't be that difficult to do it, would it? And this is, I think, the problem we have. Mm. And no doubt you'll share on this later on. And it's something that I was talking to my wife just before coming on air, singing a song by Will Party called Ship of Fools. And it's that avarice and greed. And it's difficult at times, I suppose, because the more money you have behind yourself, the more difficult it is to say, no, I've got to diversify here. I've got to think of other people. But hopefully we can talk about that later on, how you actually overcame that as well in your career. So that'd be great.
Yeah.
Great answer. Thank you. Question 4, outside of family events, Paul, what has been your most enjoyable day out to date, please?
I have been fortunate, mostly because my work in life takes me into interesting places, meeting interesting people. In a weird but wonderful way, that makes you much more fond of the simple. And the life well lived is about the place you probably, one of our best friends describes it as the place you go and put your slippers on. So for me, I can't give you a specific day. I just give you a specific place where there have been hundreds of days, which is an island just off La Rochelle on the west coast of France called Ile de Ré. Mm-hmm. It's 19 miles long, 3 miles wide, totally flat. Most people cycle, and it's very, very French. It's protected by World Heritage stuff. It's its own microclimate, it's its own microeconomy, and you just walk and cycle everywhere and potter around from restaurant to bench and present yourself as French. And so we started going on holiday there thanks to some neighbours of ours, actually, who talked about it as a place to go when we moved back to Exeter 2006-07, I think it was. And our family grew up with our best friend's family by going on holiday together and pitching our campsite pitches, if you like, from a long way away to then next to each other, then joining them up on 2 pitches and sharing food like thought we were proper French, I suppose. And now we go at least once a year and just go out of season and to use the phrase, we know we're going to put our slippers on. You know it's going to relax you, and the world just passes you by and you reconnect. It's more a place that happens to have lots of enjoyable days out, but that would be my answer to that question.
Well, from that to what has been your most embarrassing moment to date then, Paul?
Mm-hmm. Well, that links back to, it's the hardest one to answer because you've got to knock yourself down to do it. Something. This locks back to you put your hand in the fire and then you realise it burns you. I have unfortunately had to learn all my hard lessons by my own mistakes, and then the product of them being where embarrassment flows.
Yes.
And it's a slightly thematic answer again rather than a specific, because I could have cracked plenty, unfortunately, of here's a funny one where I just ended up looking like a Charlie. The worst embarrassment I've suffered was as a director at Barclays, and I was the youngest director in the UK retail bank. So I was in my early 30s, and I always used to go on to people about when they hit 33, I was just turning 30. And I always used to go on to people about their 33rd birthday. So what have you achieved? Look what Jesus did in his 33 years on this life, and use it as a bit of a stick or a challenge. And I remember I turned into my 30th birthday and I said to Karen and our best friends in Warwick at the time, I'm going to spend the next 3 years to see how far I can get in my career. It was probably, the heart was right in the aspiration. The execution was terrible and hugely embarrassing because I was trying to live as a Christian in a world that all my choices were about getting my work-life balance wrong. And the embarrassment was fundamentally that I wasn't listening to the feedback of those around me. I wasn't making myself accountable to the fact that my work-life balance was wrong. And was impacting all sorts of things relationally. Particularly, I was trying to present myself as a youth worker and active in the church, etc., etc. I was terribly absent as a good or even sometimes present father of 2 young children at the time and husband. And when it finally caught up with me, I know the word I used and the sentiment I experienced was of what your question asked, which is embarrassment, because words and figures didn't match. To use what someone challenged me on subsequent to that, which are words that have stuck with me for a long time and still do now, so I'll share them. When our character and our gifts get out of line, we've got a problem. My gifts were sufficient to be able to push on and be, career minded and achieve in a career sense at Barclays. But my character was nowhere near mature as my gift usage was. And the out of alignment caused a lot of embarrassment and frankly, a lot of repentance to try and get back on track. That's probably where a lot of my comment about putting my hand in the fire comes from. But the embarrassment is I wasn't who I said I was. And it was laid bare. It needed to be, because I probably would never have listened and taken it on board.
But you've learnt from it. That's the thing. And it's been floated up through all your brain cells, whatever, for you to realise that there was an issue here. The word character certainly was thrown at me many a time by somebody you must probably know as well when I was in radio. And he would say, look, I don't care how good somebody is behind the microphone. It's the character of that person that is more important. And when he first said that to me, it was like, oh, I never thought of it like that. And that was a real wake-up call for me as well in my particular case. Paul, thank you for those answers. There's so much we could discuss. I could do the lazy thing and say, Paul, what would you like to discuss about? What's on your heart at the moment? Which could be fair comment. I don't normally do that. But I think today's podcast is going to be different completely. So bear in mind who you are and who you were and who you will be. Imagine you and I sitting down in a pub having a pint. So with that in mind, here's my question. We hear people saying all the time that money is the root of all evil. And there'll be a few of us that go say, no, it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. What have you seen in your life to date on that? What do you think?
I expand the answer with people because I often talk about money. You'd expect my career looks like I've spent all my time around people with money or people who need to work out what to do with money. It's what you do with your money that really makes the difference, I think. And if you dig into what Jesus says about it, that's exactly the point he's making, isn't it? And it's partly linked to too much is given, much is expected. I think I learned the most, when my third year of my graduate training contract at Barclays, was my year in Monte Carlo. I went out there because I had a degree in French and economics, so it was fairly obvious they were going to send me out there. At the time, this was where are we now? Early 90s. At the time, I thought, great. I'd met Karen actually at a wedding, my brother's wedding the night before. So morally, I was on a different campus than probably I would have been, praise God. So it then became about a year. What does a year of working in Monte Carlo look like? And I arrived with no clients. It was all about client relationship management. At the time, you had to have 100,000 French francs to even open a current account, and which would probably translate, I know it's now €1 million. So, it gives you an idea of the sort of people you're working with. And they just threw you into it. And I learned a lot of things very quickly. First thing I learned was my first client, literally, I was sat at my desk after they'd done the week of kind of orientation and training. My first client who walked in, that comes to the reception desk, and if you've ever been to Monte Carlo, the branch is directly up the top of the gardens opposite the casino. So you're right in the centre. It's the largest bank in Monaco. It banks the royal family and International Management Group, which is a great sports agency. So most of the tennis, motor racing, golf, blah, 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 stars are banking there. The receptionist brought this couple over to me, and they said, Paul, and she was French, the lady, so it was slightly pidgin English, said, this is Monsieur Hutchins and Mademoiselle Minogue. Like that. Kylie Minogue and Michael Hutchins wanted a mortgage. And I was like, oh my, can you imagine? I was like mid-20s, barely knew what I was doing. And I realised then I could probably blag for England, frankly. That was the scene setter to the year. Every Friday night I'd go to Princess Stephanie's flat in Monaco for a party because that's where you met people. And if you had nothing to do with an evening, go to a function or whatever, you'd cold call by knocking on the yachts at Monte Carlo Harbour, trying to work out who the owner was and whether they had a load of cash they wanted to invest and all that stuff. But you know what? The biggest thing I realised was actually all the money in the world, and obviously those people had all the money in the world, which is why we were trying to be their bankers, didn't make you happy. I had so many conversations with people where I realised, because of the way they were presenting themselves, that the razzmatazz and the fuss and the glitz brought them no happiness. And it was the best thing that could happen because I realised that actually the point and the purpose of money is really about what you do when you give it away, or for what motive you are using it. And I realised that by not falling into the trap of making my own mistakes, really, because I was just vicariously listening and journeying with those people. And I had some, I can't, probably not appropriate to drop all the names in, but the number of conversations I sit and have a drink with or lunch with, where you just realise that actually money is often a vehicle for people to express what's really going on in their heart. And for me, therefore, money became, it is about what you do with it and what your motive around it is. But fundamentally, it's also because everyone talks about money, like in Britain, we talk about the weather. It's a chance for a conversation. And I think over my whole career, when I left Barclays in 2005, I just bought a bank for them in Monte Carlo. And I thought, well, Karen and I didn't feel it was right to go and base ourselves in Johannesburg. But again, that deal was about money as far as the papers were writing about it, because it was Barclays going back into South Africa, blah, 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 chance to meet Mandela on the deal. But you know what? What it really taught me again was money is a means. It's about how they were regenerating their economy, and fundamentally, it was about a series of conversations that led to an acquisition of a bank by Barclays. But it was only about conversations, because in the end, you have to tie a deal together with money. But it was a bigger purpose. And that became my binding theme in my career and my journey through banking. I had the privilege of leading Barclays Group Christian Fellowship, which was a global organisation with 3,000 and something Christians in it across the world, and part of my job. And again, you realise again and again by referencing to people in their own career and their own job types, which were multiple, from a cashier up to a very senior person, they saw it as a chance to help people with money, but ultimately a chance to help people, full stop. It was just a privilege, but I learned a lot of that from my first year in Monte Carlo. Hopefully, that kept me humble around whether the numbers have few noughts or big numbers of noughts after them. There's still a human behind the money, and really it's their relationship with money is really a lot to do with their relationship with life, and beyond that, the God who gives them the money and gives them their life. So that's how I tied a lot of that together for myself.
And on the musical theme, I suppose the opposite side of that is what John Lennon was singing about: money can't buy you love.
Yeah, exactly.
Consequently, meeting all these people, and without name dropping, because it wouldn't be fair, how do you think they were about maybe being vacuous? Maybe they haven't really got a life, but they've got all this money.
I'm not sure it'd be vacuous. Friendless is probably the word, So what does deep relationship look like when you've chosen, accidentally or deliberately, to make your relationship with your CV or your work title or your bank account? Ultimately, it doesn't fill the relational void, does it? And so I think my big takeout from that was relationship is important. It's key, regardless of who you are. It's just you can use some of the veneer, the veneer of a large bank account, the veneer to be able to host a large event or pay for something, or indeed, hang around in high circles because you've got a big job title or whatever. But when the music fades and all is stripped away, to go for that old song, which is so relevant, you've got to come back to something, which is who you are and what you believe in. Over the years, I've got very much more passionate and very much more open about saying to people, I think one of our big issues in society is we all know that one way or another we'll acknowledge we're made up of the physical, the emotional and the spiritual. Our society loves to present the art, you've got to be physically fitter. When we all subscribe to that, don't we, regardless of who we are and regardless of whether we can be bothered. Emotionally, psychological well-being, mental health has become the thing, understandably and correctly. So we invest in that. But alongside that, the question of who am I spiritually, who am I connected to, tends to be the thing that everyone pushes away. The danger is you make yourself God until stuff goes wrong and you realise you aren't God after all. But I think there's a big question, which is often you encounter it with people with lots of money, which is they leave the spiritual side alone because they can invest in their gym and their well-being is pretty good because they can afford to wrap themselves in good things, until fundamentally a lack of relationship, spiritually and humanly, comes home to roost. And then you look for meaning and you look for the purpose beyond. In business terms, you call it purpose beyond profit, don't you? But the purpose beyond the things that you think make you good. And that seems to me to be the path, regardless of whether you're rich, famous or not at all. And having the courage to ask people where they are with all three of those aspects, but particularly the spiritual one, I think it's a gift to be able to go to someone who's got a lot of money, relationally, just checking in, see how you are, because actually most people don't. Most people are hanging off them because they're their payday or they're their boss who pays their wages and all the rest of it. And again, I saw that massively in Monte Carlo, the number of agents and hangers on and and what have you, that with the entourage, if you like, and you see it anytime you see a rich and famous person here, don't you? But they've still got the relational void, and the chance to be part of something which brings relational richness and satisfaction was always the biggest joy for me.
I had the privilege, as I think I've been discussing in various emails in the past, that as a training officer in the insurance business, it was great to meet fellow Christians in it. But we all had one thing in common, and that was that we weren't being paid by the insurance company to, for want of a better word, proselytise with all the course members in front of us. We had a job to do. And I never had to have the problem within the training department of having to say, well, look, I'm sorry, that is now pushing the barrier too far. I can't go across it because of my faith. What about yourself when you were in Barclays and within the finance industry, whereby you would say, no, enough's enough, I can't do that? What happened to you then? What decisions did you make?
Barclays was relatively straightforward, I think, partly because I was on a fast track and I was ahead of the curve, and people, I was almost able to create an environment where people acknowledged my faith very early and easily. When I got my first director job, I'll tell you two stories. My first director job in Barclays, we just bought the Woolwich Building Society. John Varley was the CEO of Barclays. He had been a bit of a mentor to me. Took me on the team, cut my teeth doing deals there, and at the end of it, they offered me the chance to be the savings and investments director for the combined group. That was in my early 30s, as I said earlier. And my boss at the time, David, called me in and he said, we're going to take a risk with you, Paul. He said, we want to offer you the job of savings and investments director. And he proceeds to spend what seemed like an age, it probably wasn't really, telling me how I should do my job. And I said to him, David, if it's okay with you, I'd like to try something that I've learned in this environment. And if it doesn't work in 6 months, totally either get rid of me or tell me what I should be doing differently. And he said, what's that then? And I'd been on a training thing, which was ostensibly based on an airline in America called Southwest Airlines. And America's in-country flights are obviously hugely price competitive, the cutthroat really. And Southwest Airlines had invented a concept called the employee service profit chain. A happy employee will deliver great service. Great service will deliver you profit because the client will come back in the end and the relationship grows, if you like. And they turned it into a really sophisticated thing in the States, including, there's lots of Harvard Business Reviews on this, but where, for example, appraisals were done by your staff on you upward, not downward. And you got your bonus based on what your staff said you were like as a human being and a boss. And they dug it into the infrastructure of the whole company. And I said, I want to do that in my team. Barclays wasn't well known for its savings, and we were running employee opinion surveys. I said, I wanted to do that. And I did, and they let me do it. We went to #1 new business gathering in the UK for all financial institutions using the Woolwich and Barclays brands, just using a really talented team. And I learned about, you don't have to be the doer, you just have to be the enabler and the facilitator and the person who, I call it kicking stones out the road for others to really find their potential. That for me was about my faith not getting in the way, but having to just poke a bit where I had an easier opportunity. The opposite was true, which was the direct answer to your question. When I left Barclays, I went out on my own, acted as a consultant and a non-exec director, I still do. And I was introduced by a friend in Exeter to a guy called Simon Chamberlain, who was the yin to my yang, the brutal insurance company, Bluefin it was called, real salesperson. Been involved in all sorts of big sales things inside the financial services industry. I'd never heard of him, which annoyed him because he thought I should have heard of him. We formed what became Succession Wealth. I put my money that I got from as I left Barclays, we just co-joined and we invested to create a company that tried to ride a different regulatory regime in financial advice, which was the likes of the Pru didn't pay the commission, but the client paid for the advice. And it took off. In 2014, we got private equity in, and I took on leading. When you start a business, you take on everything. I was the HR director for a while, the legal director, all sorts. Now paid for anyone to do that on his own by Aviva anyway. So money isn't the issue in the business. The question of the values and the conduct and the behaviours and why we're here, very much the issue. Private equity brought its challenges. We took on money to buy businesses to join together to create the company we are now. And I've done nearly 70 deals with our independent financial advisor businesses across the country. Some were owned by Christians, which was delightful. Some not. But in about 2018-19, the private equity meetings got harder and harder. We were under pressure about whether we were going to sell the business, we were going to make them and ourselves a return and all the rest of it. And I walked into London for a board meeting I got to really hate the board. No, hate. I don't like the word hate. I disliked heavily the board meetings, because they just sometimes turned into bully boy sessions by private equity, the worst behaviours. And generally, our private equity guys were really good actually. But I remember I walked along the street. It was a November day, and I looked up at the glass windows of the boardroom we were going into in the private equity house's offices, and I started crying. I just couldn't get myself into a place where I wanted to be there at all. I've never had it in my life. I normally go straight towards situations and try and work with them. And I just didn't want to be there. And it was where the use of money had become a tool for bullying, really. The private equity house are funding the business, which they are, it's their right. But who I was getting crushed in that, even though I thought we were doing well. And, ultimately the proof that we did well was in 2022 when Aviva said, we want to buy you and you can become our financial advice business. But at the time, it was crushing. And do you know what? I resigned from the board, not from the company. I said, I just don't want to come to the board meetings anymore. And I think, to be honest, they probably had come to the same conclusion. I'm sure my body language had given that away. God, I tell you what, talk about how walking away from the company you founded in the sense of being at the top of it. Simon, my business partner, had died of a stroke in 2017. So it was on me. We had a great team and we'd evolved into a pretty big business. But how I got myself through a place where I felt as though money and power was being used against me was a really challenging place for me. In 2019, of course, COVID came. As part of giving up my role, I decided that I would try and make myself expendable to the business if ever they wanted to. And I'm still there now, so they use me for certain things, which is fine. And COVID came, and everyone had to lead their team through Teams and on Zoom, didn't they? Do you remember? I had no staff. And I laughed to myself thinking, what a gift this is. I don't have to have any team meetings. We're using this newfangled stuff. And I don't have to go to board meetings in London and be called onto Zooms and all that stuff. So I kind of developed a bit of a slightly random, humorous side to it. But I'll never forget the moment where stuff got too much for me. And it felt like money had been used and power had been used against me. That wasn't, I'm sure, the fundamental objective. But it was the one time I can point to in my life where I knew I had to pivot. That was how that happened. But weird.
Was there ever an occasion where you had to say, no, I can't employ him because he's a Christian? And I'm going to bring in a football reference here. I can't remember who the professional footballer was I was chatting to. This goes back about 20, 30 years. But he said he wasn't picked by a very well-known manager because the manager says, I can't buy Christian footballers because they don't have it in them to do tackles the way I want them to tackle. They won't go in hard and all that sort of stuff. So therefore, I'm not going to buy this player because he was a Christian. If we transferred that sort of mode of operation to the business world, what did you see in that about Christians in the workplace who maybe weren't getting that far because they, were maybe using their Christian faith for the wrong reasons or didn't have the strength to carry on? What do you think?
I never saw much of that being overtly used against people. Often I saw it used as, qualities that emerged from that about being trustworthy and competent and what have you. I always found that, and Barclays was a good environment to work in for me, and the people I came across I wouldn't criticise at all. I think there were attributes which were turned into positives. And I think we forget that sometimes, to be genuinely known as having integrity and being trustworthy and being committed and being, values led, which means your behaviours should be, different. I always found that to be hugely positively spoken over by Christians. So that's my first point. I think I'd flip it to the positive rather than the negative. I think the downside becomes when the culture you either choose to be in or find yourself in isn't that which aligns to how God would have you walk. And, that is the turn, asking to be turned the blind eye to stuff that's not right, be a party to a manufactured exit process for someone who doesn't fit anymore, or where you've got a selection pool to try and whittle the numbers down. Or probably the thing I found most relevant was when you were asked to work in patterns, hours or days, particularly to do with Sundays, that just don't work. They're not right, and that latter one was the one I found where I think people were and have been and are selected against, if you see what I mean. I've had real challenges with how I talk about my views on Sabbath and Sundays. And interestingly, I found it much easier as those around us in general have found life more difficult, more pressured, more broken, less less chance to have a pause, and they're getting iller, or they're getting tired, or they're getting more irritable. And I say it's because I'm just so exhausted, stressed. And I often speak there about how it cannot be a coincidence, in my view, whether you believe or not. And that's generally how I try and frame my conversations with people, that at the point we decided there was no God and there was therefore no need to observe Sabbath, all these things began to pop out of the woodwork. I just cannot see, Christian or not Christian, that you can't make the join work. And I've got quite emboldened about talking about that in a workplace context as well, about the culture you set for your individuals. And I think in some ways the working from home stuff versus in the office, it's kicking off again now, isn't it? Becomes an easy place to speak into that topic about actually the Bible has something to say about this, and as it has about so many things, if not all things, of course. But I've actually learned to be much more strong as a communicator around many of those things, because I think now is the time to do that. And I actually think the world has come to a place where it listens a bit more because it can see the consequences of the choices. Again, it may also be because I'm passionate about work-life balance, because I've got it so badly wrong back in the day. But I actually find standing, speaking, sharing the reason why, not just the belief, if you like. I don't work on Sundays. Okay. That sounds slightly religious, doesn't it? I don't work on Sundays because I've not found those difficult conversations to have with people, and I've not observed overtly discrimination because of that.
I've said it many times on previous podcasts. In fact, I was doing a training course as a training officer up in Birmingham. It just so happened that Bristol City were playing Birmingham City that night, but down at Ashton Gate in Bristol. So what do? You finish the course, you get in your car, you drive the 120 odd miles down to Ashton Gate, get to the ground, watch the game, to drive back. And the moral of the story is that I then walked back into the hotel about 11:30 at night, and all the course members were there having a beer, as you do. It was great. I went and joined them. And of course, they're more relaxed. They know where they are. They know that I'm a Christian. And it's amazing how many times in situations like that, whereby they suddenly say, well, why are you a Christian or whatever? It's not to be demeaning to you. They genuinely want to know. So for those that are listening today,
yes,
and for who you were at the time, as well as who you are now, how many times, without naming names, have you been somewhere and all of a sudden they want to ask these questions and you would think, never in a million years would that person ask me that kind of question, you were able to share your faith? What happened?
Yeah, lots. I mean, it happens to me. I was sitting in coffee houses. I sat with, my dad died, unfortunately, just before Christmas. And I sat with his brother, 75 years old. I haven't seen him for 40 years because he was airbrushed from my history last week. And he asked me the self-same question about why he's not a Christian. I find it the most natural thing to try and be. Now, I must confess, sometimes probably when I was being a bit chameleon, that wouldn't have been true. Just to be who I am and expect, or even try and introduce the question of, let me tell you a few things about why I am what I am and what I've learned along the way, and introduce Christ in that sense. I think there's an equal and opposite. The time probably for a season when I was walking a fine line, let's put it that way, that I got most talked about my faith was when I stayed up instead of going to football, or instead of going to bed, or instead of switching to the Coca-Colas, and I joined the drinking club. And you'd be the silly boy who was part of the silly tricks, and then someone would often mention to me, I didn't expect that of you, Paul. And it manifests itself in just overdoing. And so people would be my conscience, even though they themselves weren't coming from the same place as I professed to. So I found that there was definitely a spell where that was my norm. And then more often than not, I'd stand back and people would talk as they just loosened up in a social setting. Because if they like you, they'll talk to you, won't they? Mm. And and it comes back to what I said earlier, whether you're rich or poor, famous or not famous, you've still got the same longing in your heart, haven't you? To be accepted, to find purpose, and to know freedom rather than fear. And I find that's not that difficult a thing to do with people in terms of just be open to a conversation. It's a lot to do with how much courage you have, or belief that you've got something of value to them that you want to share, That's got easier as I've got older, I confess. But I've always felt that the big thing we've got is a gift from God to give away. And, if we keep it to ourselves, what's the point? If someone said to you, what's your spiritual gifts for? Evangelism isn't one of my most naturally strong ones, if I'm honest. But I do find it very compelling to be in a place where someone wants to talk to you about who you are and why you are who you are.
Do you know what? I want to talk about something that I don't think we've talked about for ages, actually, on these podcasts. And you've already referenced it a couple of times. So In the remaining time, please, I'd like you to discuss the word character, what it means to you. And obviously, we've already preempted it by saying that you are a mentor to people, you're prepared to talk to people about it. For those that are thinking, well, what am I going to do today for the rest of my life? Do I need a new job, for instance? Or I'm struggling at work at the moment, all those sorts of things. We've been able to round them all up. We've put them in a nice room. We will you on in front of a lectern. And I say, please speak to these people, Paul, because they're at the crossroads of life for a variety of reasons. And your chosen subject is character. What would you say to them, please?
Great. Do you know, I author quite a lot of articles at the moment in the secular press, and I always talk about things that ultimately try and point people back to character. So you've hit me in a good spot here. So the first thing I normally say is, it's who you are when no one's looking. And it's an easy phrase to say, we've all heard it, but fundamentally it's who you are. And that's that's your character. I learned more about character and the question of, are you who you say you are, i.e. is your character what you present yourself as being, from Rob Parsons, Care for the Family. He's been a huge influence in my life, directly in person and through his work. And when he wrote a book called The Heart of Success, you know, sometimes you flick the open cover of a book and people have written about it. You know, normally it's the great Christian leaders, isn't it? And I used to think, oh, great, I wonder if they've been paid to say that. I bet they've never read it. Somewhere along the line, Rob Parsons, when he did a reissue of The Heart of Success, he asked me to write. And I'll tell you why he asked me. You'll like this story. Because I wrote about The Heart of Success as a book and its impact on me about character in the foreword to Exeter City's first ever match at Wembley, the playoff final. And I thought, this is my chance. This will be read by people all over. And this is my chance. I'm going to write about the importance of character and who you are. Obviously, I wove into the context of the football club's owned by its fans. It's a true supporters' trust. So there's a soul in there, and there's a purpose beyond just the fact we're a football club.
Yeah.
And I referred to my own journey with the question of character as Rob Parsons' book, The Heart of Success, taught me a lot of what I anchored in this. And it was all wrapped up in one illustration, which was, be careful the ladder you put your wall up. Because if you climb that ladder and it's against the wrong wall, it's a very humbling thing to come back down the ladder and realise you should have propped it up against a different wall. It's the core illustration for me in the book. The ladder in question, I always took to be, who are you? What's your character? Who you are when no one's looking? And get that right, and you get the ladder in the right place, and all else will follow from it. And so my answer to your question is really, for me, character is ultimately whichever lens or prism someone's looking at you through, you actually are. And when you make mistakes, I think we hear it all the time, don't we? They are character forming, but they're character forming if you choose to take the lessons into yourself, which is what I always say when I'm mentoring. You know, I will try and connect with the situational stories of even as we live right beside Exeter University. I see lots of students. Of a student who's got a lot of time, and if you say to them, I only really see students at 7:30 in the morning, it's a good test of whether or not they want to be with you, because they don't tend to get up at 7:30 in the morning for no reason. And I'll sit there and I'll talk to them about their night before or their life. And we'll generally end up talking about character and questions of good and bad character, evidence of good and bad character. Why are the discrepancies and dichotomies and what have you? Because we're putting lots of ladders up against walls all the time. They're not necessarily the same wall, but they're not necessarily the best wall. But to know who you are will give you the best way of knowing, frankly, which wall you should get your ladder up against and how far you should climb becomes then a factor that follows on from it. And that's how I generally talk about character. I think what I said earlier has been hugely demanding for me in my own life. I'm fortunate because God's opened lots of doors. But at this point in my life, the end of every year, I take time between Christmas and New Year to say, what do I think God would teach me about last year that he wouldn't want me to be a foundation point for the next year, or vice versa? And this, again, as it happens, talks to the question of character. So I think I've learned, and I've made some mistakes with some of the things I've chosen to try and press into that really are, they're born out of opportunity, but they've been me pressing into them. And I know that right now God is saying to me, and I wish I'd heard him, this isn't the first time he said it, you need to be in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat, Paul. And I had a very clear illustration just in my mind. It came to me about, okay, I'll say I'm in the passenger seat from time to time, but every now and then I'll lean over and tug on the steering wheel because I think I can do better than God does. And mistakes tend to follow when I put myself in the driver's seat rather than allowing God to be in the driver's seat, because I think my character and my gifts, so let's call it my gifts, is I'm a good driver. I'm actually a terrible driver, to be honest. But that's about my characters. Am I truly prepared to make myself a servant to Jesus and be in the passenger seat, knowing that he never takes us on a road which is bad for us or not? And that's there's my challenge to my character right now. So to answer your question directly, how do people, in a workplace, how do you feel that character? I would say be who you know God has made you to be, but always, always be the passenger. And a passenger, my wife is probably a good example of this. That doesn't mean you don't call out stuff that's bad driving, as in she calls me out, not allows me to call her out. So if you're in a bad environment at work, or you've got a bad boss, you see bad values, bad behaviours, you see unethical stuff, you call it out, because that speaks to the question of love speaks out against stuff that isn't loving and isn't good, isn't it? And that's what Jesus did. He spent a load of his time with the Pharisees doing exactly that, didn't he? So I think unhappy, unfulfilled, uncertain in a workplace, understand why. And it might be you're not in the right place. It might be that what's going on around you isn't the right thing, but actually calling it out is a good thing. Or it may just be you're seeing the reason why you're there. How do I turn this into something which is glorifying to God, about either the way I am, what I do, how I do it, the attitude I do it with? All are important things. That's probably my answer.
Well, I'm glad you said about calling out, because I was thinking of going down this line actually, but I didn't know how to frame it. But you've just brought it to my attention. So let's go for it then. But I'm going to put the focus on you again, especially as we know, and if we watch certain dramas and certain thrillers, especially from America, we see the love of money and they're going around killing people because they need to protect their money. I'm not saying that happens at all. And so have there been any opportunities for you to learn from this, whereby you've been put in that very same position, not having to kill anybody, but you know that what they're asking you to do is certainly unethical, immoral, that sort of thing? What did you do, and what can we learn from it?
Okay, first time I really would say I encountered that was when I was first asked to do a kind of headcount reduction in Barclays. There was a cost reduction going on, as usual in big companies, it tends to be, everyone takes a percentage of headcount out, and that's the way it goes. But there was definitely a process that was tokenistic around a vehicle to take people out who generally people would say should have been taken out because they weren't liked, as opposed to a very methodical, frankly, values-driven thing where there's proper assessment and proper understanding. And I stood very firm in the light of, I didn't want the guilt of just being a hatchet man, if you see what I mean. And I learned a lot there about the value of partnering with an HR, a human resources function that understood and had integrity, but understood humanity as well as process, but also held to good process. And I got my way in that situation because I was very open about speaking out against agendas, if you like. It gave me a lot of courage, but I knew it was the right thing to do. What I learned from there was, if you know it's the right thing to do, you should say it and do it, frankly. My other example would be I roll into Succession Wealth, and Simon Chamberlain, my partner, but the CEO of the company, I've never been a CEO, I've been more MD type. He used to try and claim moral authority, decision-making authority in board meetings by calling me the Reverend in front of people. And, I smile about it. I think it's quite funny, really. I always used to say, well, he only does it because he feels threatened. But how I lay my ego down when someone's trying to also trample it down, and just almost like meekly smile, but know that fundamentally it's bullying behaviour, I found really tough, really, really tough. And in the end, I decided the only way I could deal with it was to go and talk to him about the fact that I felt he was bullying me because it suited an agenda. This is my business partner, and we were never close as friends. Everyone thought we were really close, and when he died, I think everyone thought I was morose in the extreme, probably, but I wasn't. It was just people die. I took it as an opportunity to talk about the fact that no one's got a divine right to stay on this planet. But calling out behaviour that's inappropriate, that's affecting you as a person, I think is hugely, hugely important. And it might have hefty consequences, but fundamentally, if you don't, I think you just live in a crushed world that starts to define you rather than, you being the bird in the cage that can sing your songs. So there are probably two examples I give you about where situations emerged that I wasn't comfortable with and how I handled them. There are many, many times, however, where I think I've observed stuff and not gone towards it. And I wish I had. My wife's Karen's a counsellor, as in not a political one, but I'm her main client, according to her. She would always say to me, "You're privileged to be in relationship with many, many people." This isn't quite the word she'd use, but the love you express for them is often in when you call out things you see in them that's not good. Because ultimately that will express to them a situation that might point them to freedom, not to being trapped in fear or bad behaviours. And frankly, she's right. And I wish I'd learned that earlier in my life. Even in the little things that I see, just make you go, oof, words used, tactics deployed, things asked of you, or things asked of others. I just wish I'd called them out a bit more often. And again, to anchor back to your question, mostly that's got nothing to do with money. It's got nothing to do with status. Some of the most snivelly, weaselly, bullying, poor-charactered individuals are often some of the people who just sat in teams trying to protect their job, because they think they're clever and it's called politics and what have you. I wish I'd called it out a bit more. I really do.
2 occasions in my life where I've been bullied big time. And one of them I lost my job over because I, as it turned out, was sent over to go and assess how good this person was in their job. Little did I know that the independent company wanted him sacked. They thought he was rubbish. But actually, as far as I was concerned, he attained the right levels along with other things. And that's how I lost my job as a result of it. Do you know what? Looking back on it now, I would still do exactly the same thing. I would still have signed him on.
Good for you.
That's what the job is about. It's horrible when you're in there. The mental pressure that you get, and I'm a very sensitive person as well, it really sort of builds up. But like you're saying about the Sabbath, you need a day off as well. But in the remaining couple of minutes before we get to the final question, for those that are really going through it at the moment about being bullied, whether it be in the Christian environment, which does happen, let's face it, or in the secular environment at work or whatever, they feel they're being bullied for whatever reason. From your point of view, as a mentor now, what would you say to them?
I'd say talk to the person who's bullying you. It's a biblical model, isn't it? Go to the person who's abusing you, criticising you, talking down to you, doing wrong to you. If you don't get through that conversation with a sense of resolution, go to the one above them that can sort it. Ultimately, if we make ourselves victims, I think there's a risk we perpetuate a stereotype. As Christian, we can trample on them because they won't come back at us. I think give yourself permission to say, this is me standing up for the person God's made me to be, and I need justice in that. I need a sense of freedom, not of fear. That's a phrase I've used plenty of times. If I might illustrate with one phrase to try and help people, I've bought a lot of businesses for businesses I've been a part of, from the bank at Barclays to, as I say, nearly 70 financial advice businesses to make Succession. I learned very early when I was buying businesses for Succession that businesses are actually just groups of people. And it sounds almost simplistic to say it, but actually they wouldn't be called companies if the revenue department or the tax department or the law or the regulator didn't say they have to be structured in this way, limited company, partnership, whatever. So the structure is a man-made construct for good reason, to do with governance and control and what have you. But fundamentally, a bit like the employee service profit chain I talked about earlier, businesses are just people. And the good businesses, of course, they all get on together, they're aligned and they're motivated and they observe a set of standards and quality and deliver. But when you buy businesses, the thing that always goes wrong is if you get two sets of people, they might be doing perfectly decent jobs in their particular thing, but if they don't connect at a human level, at a values level, at a reason we're here level, at the way we do stuff, it will never work, because it will be like putting two opposing forces together in the end and it will crack. And I think inside a business, when you're feeling oppressed, feeling as though the world you inhabit is not right, it's easy to look at the thing, the shell you're in, or the pressures that might be to do with running that shell, the company. Almost always it's to do with the people. What is it that's about these people, or this person who's my boss or my colleague, that is just not aligning to who I am? It might be me. I might come in feeling terrible today and I'm looking for a fight. And if that's endemic, if it's about I'm in the wrong place now because I'm just misfitting, have the courage to go and find the right place. If it's about a particular individual with a particular set of situations, do what the Bible says and go in grace and love towards them. And if they don't receive in grace and love, go elsewhere to try and get the resolution. But if not, you're in the wrong place, because the group of people you're in is not a good group of people for you.
Yeah, and like you said in a previous example, you were given a job to do, you knew it was wrong, so what did you do? Rather than carry it out, you went and talked to the human resources team, who are part of the same organisation, because guess what? that's what they do. So you can't be told off for that. If anything,
Mhm.
you're using wisdom and obviously facilitate it, which is one of my favourite buzzwords.
Absolutely.
I did say there won't be any more questions, but there is actually, in light of that, if that is okay. Before we get to the final question, I sound like Paul now in the Bible. Finally.
Mhm. Yeah.
We're now then moving into your next career. We're at the start of 2025. What do you think is God saying to Paul Morrish as to where he wants him to go in the next years ahead, please?
Do you know, since we sold Succession in 2022, the phrase I've heard most about people's perspective on my working life, if you like, is, and I've always thought, work is just a part of your life, so you need to think about work as part of life, not the other way around, is what you're doing with your retirement, Paul. And I'm like, what do you understand by the word retirement? I met a guy at a wedding. I don't chair, I'm part of the leadership team of a charity called Devon Christian Youth Camps. We have about 700 people in a camps organisation in South Devon. And one of the campers there went to America, a guy called Matt, and married a girl called Kindle. And we went to the wedding in Dallas in 2005. And her dad, he's called Ed Frazier, great Christian man. He came over to Exeter to visit Matt's parents in a village outside Exeter. And I said to him, what are you doing with your retirement then, Ed? And he said, big bear of a man. He said, Paul, what do you understand from the Bible about the word retirement? And I'm like, oh no, I don't have a clue. And he told me that there's only one real translated reference, which is, I think, in Ezekiel or somewhere like that, where a priest who wouldn't get out the way had imposed upon him what we would today call retirement. And he said, so it's not a biblical idea, Paul, unless you're in the way. I was thinking, I've got to bounce back here. So I said to him, what's your philosophy then, Ed? He said, I break the word down, Paul. He said, when the car's engine is stuttering and slowing up, it's fine. But if the wheels, the tyres, need sorting out because they're shredded, you go in and you re-tyre the car and it comes back out the garage, or whatever you call the garage, and you go again because the rest of the car's just fine. So he said, I don't believe in retirement as a concept. He said, I just believe in using who you are and the situations before you for good in the environment you're in. So my attitude to that is I always flick the question of retirement away, and I always say what's going on around me and what opportunities have I got right now. And again, it's a little bit linked to the passenger versus the driver idea. And there's been a helpful friend who I had some good accountability with from even last week, using what I have to give it away to the poor. We don't really have a lot because we give most of it away, but that's not to show off. That's just my attitude. I've not got stuff away. But I've got the opportunity to help people get off the streets, to help 16 to 18-year-olds who the councils can't cope with, even get a roof over their head, to find a purpose in life. And I'm feeling increasingly that that's a space to go with. And it is a little bit linked to the unlocking potential. The youth camps work is a year-round job, task, joy. You get the chance to work with young leaders, but ultimately it's about helping young people find the right path. So my big passion still remains. And it's very situationally different because different things pop up. But where and how can young people find the God who made them and gave them a potential they have to be real life changers in the situation they find themselves in? And that's still my big passion. It might be situationally different, and it probably will be this year, but fundamentally, that's why I get out of bed in the morning these days.
So you could be doing a Lou Macari then, getting a warehouse and putting pods in there for those that need it to get a bank account.
Who knows? There's a situation that's bouncing around that I think I disowned the fact that God has given us an opportunity. It was an investment I made that hasn't gone very well, to be honest. My motive in making the investment probably wasn't wise, but I look back now and I go, I wonder if God's actually had a bigger purpose all the way along. I just needed to find my learning in it. So yeah, there's lots of conversations with the YMCA locally as of yesterday. I don't know where that will go. It might not be what God wants, but it sits in the right space for me about what you've got to use to God's glory and to try and help others find who God made them to be.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad I didn't use the word retirement. I said, what are you going to be doing this next year and so forth. And I had a very similar conversation. A really good friend who challenged me on something similar. I'm in now my next phase. God, what do you want me to do? So we decided to mark the end of one phase to go into the next phase by going to watch a football team, funnily enough.
Yeah, it's funny, I'd say to anyone who's sat in this space, I'm not quite sure. I'm non-exec chairman of a law firm here. I'm non-exec of lots of things. I didn't ever think I would ever have anything value to add. But it's beautiful when you sit back and think, oh, and then someone comes and says, what about this?
Yeah.
It's such an affirmation, isn't it? And
yeah.
So I'm always open because I'm pretty young still, so I don't tend to pension myself off that yet. Quickly anyway.
Excellent. Well, let's move to the final question then. I do mean final question. Drum roll, please. Paul Morrish, I'd like to know, please, who your Christian hero is, someone that you can say, yes, that person has really motivated me. So, Paul Morrish, who is your Christian hero, please?
Dave Callard.
Is he the footballer?
Nope, you will have never heard of him. And
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why I have chosen him. The reason is he's probably taught me, well, he definitely taught me most of what I needed to learn and know as I grew up without realising it. The fact he's unknown to most people, I think, is a beautiful testimony about we don't need to be known to the world. We just need to be known to those who God puts in our path. The fact that he was single till the day he died, tragically early, late 60s, early 70s of cancer, I find incredibly inspiring because he just lived faithfully according to who and where God had placed him in the midst of. He was a finance director at Devon County Council. You know, there's a bit of finance in there, but he was the person who first illustrated to me that work is a mission field. The people you are with are the people you can influence for Jesus. He was also the leader of the camps organisation that he was a trustee and leader of the Devon Christian Youth Camps. And I took his place. But he had a fundamental impact on showing me that listening to God and being prepared to pass on what God is saying to you can change lives. And it was this. I left Barclays at the very end of January 2005. The job changed and they had to invite me to either change location to London. I'd always said to Karen we wouldn't live in London as a family. I was surprised to leave. I had 6 months' notice. We made decisions to just sit and wait and see what God wanted. And I journaled. It was the only time I ever really journaled those 6 months. And because it was the summer and it had been a very wet winter, so lots of Exeter Cities games had been postponed. And so there were lots of midweek games. And if I timed it right, I could go down on a Saturday morning, watch a Saturday game and know there was a Tuesday one coming up and see my mum at the same time. And there was a particular week where I did that. And on the Tuesday, I went to the game and my first ever boss at Barclays came up to me. And I could throw a stone to his house from here now. I said, Mike, what are you doing here? And he said, oh, we moved to Exeter from Oxford. Long story, but he said, why don't you come to our house? Anyway, we came to his house, saw this house we live in now and bought it. So he was used to point us to a different location. Much more relevantly, the morning I left, I was going to go back up the motorway to Warwick where we lived. And I went to see Dave and I didn't know he was in again. But he had always been the best example to me of a mentor. And I say that in the context of, my dad, I'm one of 5, so I didn't have a lot of attention from my dad. And Dave made the time to illustrate to me who Jesus was. And he didn't mind calling me out on stuff. A lot of what I've shared, I came from observing in Dave's life. And I sat there and I had a cup of tea with Dave. I said, I can't stay long, Dave, I've got to go back to Warwick. And he said, well, before I do, I need to say to you, my cancer's back and it's terminal. I would like to ask you on behalf of the trustees if you would take over the leadership of the camps. But much more than that, he said, I think God might be calling you as part of that to come back to Devon. I said, never given that a moment's thought, Dave. I probably could do the camps from Warwick. Would have been a stupid move. He said, I think God's saying that to you. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I think I'll get out of this by ringing Karen because there's no way she'll want to leave our kids who were growing up there. They were heading into secondary school. And I was on the M5 and I rung her. And I said, Karen, guess what happened? Dave Callard said this. She goes, yeah, the answer is we should. And I'm like, what? She said, we were at Bernard's Acre. There's a retreat centre on Dartmoor. I was also a trustee up for a while. New Year with a load of our friends. And she said, I had a conversation with one of our friends. And she said, I found myself saying, I think God is preparing us to come back to Exeter sometime. So she was totally ready for when I suggested it. And I would have absolutely not even expected it. The point about Karen listening to God and just sitting on it, not feeling as though she got a shout about it, not imposing it on me. And then Dave being God's voice, even in his final days, was a massive pivot in my life because I realised probably directly for the first time in many ways, God speaks directly through people if you give them the chance to talk into your life. And also there was a call to obedience there, which God has hugely faithfully honoured. And we're blessed now. Our girls did the whole secondary school thing in Exeter. They both got married 2 years ago and they live round the corner. I was out for dinner last night with one of my son-in-laws. I go out for dinner next month with the next son-in-law. And the 3 of us do it the 3rd month. And that's our pattern to try and build a relationship. And none of that would have happened if we hadn't been in Exeter. And I just am so thankful that Dave was Jesus and spoke Jesus and was an example of Jesus in all aspects of my life. So that's why I choose it.
And thank you for choosing Dave Callard. And that's what I like about this, because it's great to hear the famous names, but also the ones that are relevant to yourself growing up. And so it's great to be able to fly the flag for Dave Callard.
Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much for this time. It's just flown by. Look forward to speaking to you again sometime, or maybe on another subject, or who knows, just carry on talking about character, perseverance and perseverance. I know someone talked about it in the Bible. Paul Morrish, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Martin.
God bless. Bye-bye. Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
One of the effects it had for me was I felt a complete failure as a father.
Really?
Absolute complete failure. How could this? And you had all the stuff like, have I done too much ministry? Have I neglected the family? You know, the what, full of what ifs. After every bereavement, there's a what if.
Yes.
And here was, what if I'd done this? What if I'd said this? And have I failed as a father?
So please join me and the composer of several Christian musicals, Roger Jones, next week. Until then, cheerio.